The bus wasn't coming. 15-year-old Svetlana M. had been waiting at the stop in Angarsk for 20 minutes, and the cold was becoming unbearable. January in Siberia doesn't forgive. When the car slowed down beside her and the driver rolled down his window, she felt relief. He was wearing a police uniform. A cop. Someone safe. "You look freezing. Where are you headed? I can give you a lift." Svetlana didn't hesitate. She would later say, "I thought it was safe to go with the policeman. I was so cold from head to toe, so I accepted." She climbed into the warmth of his car, grateful, telling him her address. Who would refuse a ride from a police officer? It took her a few minutes to realize they were going the wrong way. "Excuse me, I think you missed the turn. My street is back that way." He didn't respond, didn't even look at her, just kept driving away from the lights and people toward the industrial zones. That's when fear hit her. Something's wrong. "You need to turn around. This isn't the way to my house." Silence. She looked at his face and saw the friendly expression had vanished. His face was blank, empty, like a mask. The car stopped in a deserted area. He turned toward her. She tried to open her door. Locked. Trapped. Then he was on her, hands around her throat. I was shaking. He wanted to grape me. He was mute. He didn't respond to anything. He said nothing. The silence was almost more terrifying than the violence. He wasn't angry. He wasn't emotional at all. He was just doing it like completing a task. She fought back, scratching, hitting, trying to scream, but no sound came out because his hands were crushing her windpipe. At some point she broke free, scrambling toward the driver's side. I crawled out from under him and ran to his car. I was hopping to find car keys there, but I failed. The keys weren't in the ignition. He grabbed her again, pulling her back, beating her so brutally that half of her hair was torn out from her scalp in bloody chunks. But she kept fighting. Even as the blows to her head damaged her brain, even as everything went gray, she kept fighting. And somehow she got away. She ran into the darkness, leaving blood in the snow until she found help. At the hospital, doctors assessed the damage. Brain injury, half her scalp torn away, bruises everywhere. They weren't sure she'd survive, but Svetlana lived. She spent weeks relearning how to walk, how to talk. She developed a permanent stutter. Her hair turned gray. She was 15 years old. "The attack aged me by 7 years," she would say. And as soon as she could, she went to the police. She told them everything. Her attacker was a police officer, driving a Lada Niva. She gave them details, descriptions, everything. The police listened. They took her statement, they wrote it all down. And then they did nothing. Some thought her head injuries made her confused. Others didn't want to suspect their own colleagues. When they approached the suspect she described, his wife, also in law enforcement, gave him an alibi. Case closed. Svetlana's testimony was filed away and forgotten. The man who tried to murder her continued killing for 12 more years. His name was Mikhail Popkov, and between 1992 and 2010, he murdered at least 91 women, possibly more. He was a police officer, a husband, a father, and for nearly 2 decades, he was Russia's most prolific serial killer, operating in plain sight while wearing a badge. When Svetlana finally came face to face with Popkov again, 20 years later in a courtroom during his trial, she described what happened. "I lost the ability to walk again the second I saw him." Her legs stopped working. The psychological impact was so overwhelming her body shut down. But she testified, she told her story, and this time people listened. If they'd listened in 1998 when she first reported him, dozens of women would still be alive. But they didn't believe a 15-year-old girl with head injuries. They didn't want to suspect a cop. And so the killing continued. This is the story of how a monster hid behind a badge for 18 years. This is the story of the women whose lives he stole and the 2 who survived. This is the story of institutional failures, ignored witnesses, and justice that came far too late. This is the story of Mikhail Popkov, the werewolf, the Angarsk Maniac, Russia's deadliest serial killer. And it begins with the survivor they didn't believe. To understand how Mikhail Popkov killed 91 women over 18 years without being caught, you need to understand who he appeared to be. Because from the outside, his life looked completely ordinary, normal, even admirable. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov was born on March 7, 1964 in Norilsk, one of the northernmost cities on Earth, but his family moved to Angarsk when he was young. That's where he grew up, went to school, built his adult life. His childhood, however, was marked by darkness that would shape everything that followed. His mother was an alcoholic who, according to psychiatric testimony that emerged decades later, was allegedly abusive toward young Mikhail. The specifics aren't fully documented in public records, but experts who later analyzed Popkov believed this toxic relationship with his mother became the foundation for his hatred of women. He would eventually claim that his victims reminded him of her, that he targeted women who behaved in ways he found immoral, women who drank, who went out at night, who violated his rigid sense of how women should act. He insisted, cleansing the streets, making society better by removing these immoral women. It was a justification, a twisted rationalization that allowed him to see himself not as a monster but as some kind of vigilante enforcing moral order. But justifications aren't explanations. Millions of people grow up with abusive parents. They don't become serial killers. Mikhail Popkov made a choice, over and over again, for nearly 2 decades, to hunt and murder women. His childhood trauma might help explain the psychology, but it doesn't excuse a single murder. Despite his troubled upbringing, Popkov constructed a facade of normalcy that was devastatingly effective. He joined the police force in the Irkutsk region, working as a patrol officer in Angarsk. It was a job that came with authority, respect, and critically access. He wore the uniform with pride. He was good at his job too. His performance reviews were solid. His superiors had no complaints about his work. His colleagues found him professional, reliable, maybe a bit quiet, but certainly nothing that raised red flags. Just another cop doing his shifts, going home to his family. And that family appeared rock solid. Mikhail married Elena, a woman who also worked in law enforcement in some capacity. They had a daughter together, Ekaterina, born in the late 1980s. By every outward measure, Mikhail Popkov was a devoted father. He attended parent-teacher conferences at Ekaterina's school. He drove her to music lessons every single Saturday without fail. He helped her with homework, sitting at the kitchen table patiently explaining math problems or quizzing her for tests. He worried about her safety, lectured her about the dangers of talking to strangers, insisted she call him if she ever needed a ride home. The irony would be almost darkly comedic if it weren't so absolutely horrifying. While Mikhail Popkov was warning his daughter about dangerous strangers, he himself was the most dangerous person in Angarsk. While he was driving her to music lessons on Saturday mornings, bodies of women he'd murdered were lying undiscovered in the forests surrounding the city. While he was tucking her into bed at night, evidence of his crimes was stored in his car, waiting for the next hunt. Neighbors would later describe Popkov in interviews after his arrest as polite, helpful, unremarkable. He was the kind of guy who'd shovel your driveway if it snowed overnight without being asked, who'd wave hello when you passed on the street, who'd help carry your groceries if he saw you struggling. He looked like 1,000 other middle-aged Russian men. Medium height, stocky build, dark hair, ordinary features. Nothing about him stood out. Nothing about him screamed danger. This ability to blend in, to appear not just normal but positively wholesome, is one of the most terrifying aspects of serial killers like Popkov. We want to believe that evil announces itself, that monsters look monstrous, that we'd be able to recognize danger when we see it. But Popkov was proof that evil can wear the most ordinary face imaginable. He wasn't some Hollywood villain with dead eyes and a menacing presence. He was your neighbor, your colleague. The cop who pulled you over for speeding and gave you a warning instead of a ticket because everyone has a bad day. The guy buying bread and milk at the grocery store. making small talk with the cashier about the weather. This ordinariness was his greatest weapon. It allowed him to live two completely separate lives with such precision that even the people closest to him never suspected what he truly was. During the day, Officer Popkov protected and served. He responded to calls about domestic disturbances and petty theft. He filed reports, testified in court when needed, did all the mundane work that makes up most of a patrol officer's job. He probably even investigated some of the murders he himself had committed, standing at crime scenes with his colleagues, looking at bodies he'd left there, discussing theories about what kind of monster could do such terrible things. And then night would fall, the temperature would plunge, the streets would empty, and Mikhail Popkov would transform into something else entirely. To understand how Popkov operated for so long, you also need to understand the world he was living in. Angarsk in the 1990s wasn't just a city. It was a perfect storm of conditions that allowed a serial killer to thrive. Angarsk sits in the Irkutsk Oblast region of southeastern Siberia, about 50 kilometers northwest of Irkutsk City. It's an industrial town, built in the late 1940s and early 50s around the oil refining and chemical industries. By the 1990s, it was home to roughly 250,000 people, mostly working-class families employed in the factories and plants. The smell of petroleum and chemicals hung constantly in the air. Industrial smokestacks dominated the skyline. In winter, exhaust from the factories mixed with fog to create a thick, gray atmosphere that turned the entire city into something out of a dystopian nightmare. The city itself is surrounded by taiga, those vast Siberian forests that stretch for millions of square kilometers. Dense, dark woods where you can walk for days without encountering another soul. Beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, but also the perfect place to hide bodies. The forests around Angarsk would become Popkov's dumping ground, a vast cemetery where dozens of his victims lay hidden, sometimes for years before being discovered. But the geography alone doesn't explain how Popkov operated undetected for so long. The real explanation lies in what was happening to Russia as a whole in the 1990s. December 26, 1991. The Soviet Union officially dissolved after 70 years of communist rule, and what followed was absolute chaos. They call it the Wild 90s, and that's not hyperbole. It was lawless, violent, desperate. The transition from a planned economy to capitalism happened virtually overnight without any of the institutional frameworks or regulations that make capitalism function. The result was catastrophic for ordinary Russians. Hyperinflation destroyed people's life savings almost overnight. Money that could buy groceries one week was worthless the next. State-owned enterprises collapsed, throwing millions out of work. The social safety net that had existed under communism, flawed as it was, simply disintegrated. Pensions disappeared. Healthcare became unaffordable. People who'd worked their entire lives suddenly found themselves destitute. Crime exploded. Between 1989 and 1992, most registered criminal offenses in Russia grew by 20 to 25% each year. But those are just the crimes that were reported and recorded. The real numbers were almost certainly much higher. Murder rates doubled, then tripled. Organized crime syndicates, the Bratvas, moved into the power vacuum left by the collapsing government. They took control of entire industries, established protection rackets, settled disputes with violence. Contract killings became routine. Walking down the wrong street in Moscow or St. Petersburg could get you killed. The police were completely overwhelmed. They were also desperately underpaid, with salaries that couldn't keep pace with inflation. Many cops moonlighted as private security or took bribes just to survive. Corruption became endemic. If you needed protection, you were better off going to the local Bratva than calling the police, because the criminals were the ones who actually had power and resources. And in this environment, people disappeared constantly. Bodies turned up in forests, in rivers, in abandoned buildings, in vacant lots. Most of the time, investigations went nowhere. Police departments didn't have the resources, the training, or frankly the motivation to solve every murder. Cases were closed quickly, often without proper investigation. Evidence was mishandled or simply ignored. Forensic technology lagged years behind Western standards. But perhaps most critically, there was a hierarchy of victims. Not all deaths received equal attention. If the victim was someone important, someone with connections or money or political influence, the investigation would be thorough. But if the victim was a sex worker, an addict, a homeless person, someone living on the margins of society, those cases often got minimal effort. There was this pervasive attitude, spoken or unspoken, that these people had somehow brought their fates upon themselves. They'd taken risks, they'd lived dangerous lives, they'd made bad choices, and therefore their deaths weren't as important, weren't as deserving of justice as the deaths of respectable people. This attitude, this devaluation of certain lives, is what allowed Mikhail Popkov to kill for 18 years, because he understood instinctively which victims he could target with minimal risk. He wasn't stupid. He was careful, methodical, calculating. He specifically hunted women whose society had already dismissed as less important. Sex workers, women who drank, women who went out alone at night. Women who, in the minds of many police officers and much of Russian society, were violating traditional norms of how women should behave. And he correctly calculated that their murders wouldn't generate the same level of investigative intensity as other victims. He was right. For nearly 2 decades, he was absolutely right. 1992. Mikhail Popkov is 28 years old. He's been on the police force for several years. He has a wife, a young daughter, a modest apartment, a stable job. His life from the outside looks fine, but something inside him is broken, twisted, hungry for violence. We don't know the name of his first victim. That's one of the great tragedies of this case. Some of Popkov's 91 confirmed victims were never identified. Their bodies were too mutilated by his attacks or too decomposed by the time they were discovered. Their disappearances were never officially reported because they were women with no families searching for them, or families who'd long since given up hope. They exist only as Jane does in case files, as DNA samples in evidence lockers, as numbers in Popkov's eventual confession tally. But we know she existed. We know she died violently in 1992. We know she was the first. Popkov's hunting method was simple, which is part of what made it so effective. Simplicity reduces the chances of mistakes. He would patrol the streets of Angarsk late at night, either in his official police vehicle when he was on duty, or more often in his personal car, a Lada Niva. The Niva is a distinctive Russian four-wheel drive vehicle, boxy and utilitarian, commonly used by law enforcement, security services, and anyone who needed reliable transportation in harsh Siberian conditions. Popkov's Niva became his killing machine, carrying weapons, transporting victims, dumping bodies. He drives slowly through the city, looking for the right target. Women walking alone late at night. Women leaving bars or parties, possibly intoxicated, definitely vulnerable. Women waiting at bus stops in the freezing cold like Svetlana would be years later. Women without male companions, without protection. He was looking for opportunity, for vulnerability, for women who wouldn't be missed quickly or whose disappearances wouldn't trigger major investigations. When he found the right target, he'd slow down, pull up alongside her, roll down his window. Sometimes he'd be in full police uniform. Sometimes he'd flash his badge. The uniform was crucial. It was camouflage, but more than that, it was an invitation. It told potential victims that he was safe, that accepting a ride from him was the smart thing to do. Who refuses help from a police officer? His approach varied slightly depending on the situation, but the core script remained consistent. It's cold out here. Where are you headed? I can give you a lift. I'm going that way anyway. Or sometimes, it's dangerous for a woman to be out alone this late. Let me drive you home, make sure you get there safely. The irony of that particular line, of course, is stomach-turning. The most dangerous thing in Angarsk wasn't the cold or the criminals or the wild 90s chaos. It was Officer Mikhail Popkov. They'd get into his car. Why wouldn't they? He was a cop. He was offering help. It was freezing outside. The bus wasn't coming. Walking home alone felt dangerous. Every rational calculation pointed toward accepting the ride. And that's the truly insidious thing about what Popkov did. He weaponized trust. He took the natural human instinct to trust authority figures, especially police officers, and he turned it into a trap. Once they were in his car, he'd drive. Not toward their homes, though they might not realize that immediately. Away from the city center, away from lights and people, toward the industrial zones, the forests, the remote areas where nobody would hear screams, where nobody would witness what was about to happen. At some point, the victim would realize something was wrong. They'd speak up, point out that he was going the wrong way, ask questions. And Popkov would either ignore them completely, maintaining that eerie silence that Svetlana described, or he'd make some excuse. I'm taking a shortcut. I need to make a quick stop first. Roads closed up ahead, we have to go around. Then he'd stop the car in a deserted location, and the mask would drop. What happened next is almost too horrific to describe in detail, but it's important to understand the level of violence Popkov inflicted, because it speaks to what kind of person he truly was. He would force his victims to undress, stripping away their clothes and their dignity. He kept an arsenal of weapons in his car: axes, hammers, knives, baseball bats, screwdrivers. The variety suggests this wasn't about having a preferred method. It was about having options, about using whatever tool felt right in the moment. The violence he inflicted was extreme, far beyond what would be necessary to simply kill someone. He beat his victims with such savagery that Russian investigators, hardened professionals who'd seen countless murders, were shocked by the brutality. He mutilated bodies. He destroyed faces, making identification difficult or impossible. The wounds were excessive, overkill in the most literal sense. This wasn't just about murder. This was about obliteration, about expressing a rage so intense that it required complete physical destruction of the victim. And after they were dead, after their broken bodies lay still, Popkov would grape them. He was a necrophile, someone who derived satisfaction from assaulting corpses. This detail alone speaks volumes about the depths of his depravity, the absolute absence of any normal human empathy or connection. His victims weren't people to him. They weren't even living objects of desire. They were things to be destroyed and then used. After the murder and assault, he'd dump the body. Sometimes he'd drive deep into the forest, dragging the body into the woods where it might not be found for months or years. Sometimes he'd leave it at the side of a remote road, hidden in a ditch or behind trees. Once, in an act of particular cruelty, he dumped bodies in a local cemetery, as if mocking the very concept of rest and burial. Then he'd go home. He'd wash the blood off his hands and arms. He'd change his clothes, maybe burning them or washing them carefully to remove any evidence. He'd slide into bed next to his wife Alina, careful not to wake her. He'd sleep. And the next morning he'd get up, have breakfast with his family, kiss his daughter Ekaterina goodbye as she left for school, put on his police uniform, and go to work protecting the citizens of Angarsk. As if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just destroyed another human life, as if he were normal. By the mid-1990s, it was impossible to ignore that something was very wrong in Angarsk. Bodies were appearing with disturbing regularity. A woman's body found in the forest, beaten beyond recognition. Another discovered at the side of a remote road, mutilated, partially clothed. Another in an industrial zone, dumped like trash. And another, and another. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. These weren't random murders. This wasn't domestic violence or robbery gone wrong or crimes of passion. This was serial murder, someone hunting women systematically, killing them with extreme violence, dumping their bodies in predictable types of locations. Russian police opened investigations. Detectives were assigned. Evidence was collected from crime scenes. Tire tracks, fiber samples, whatever forensic material could be gathered with the limited technology available. But the investigations kept hitting dead ends. Part of the problem was resources. The Irkutsk Regional Police were absolutely overwhelmed in the 1990s. Crime had exploded after the Soviet collapse. Detectives were handling dozens of cases simultaneously, working ridiculous hours for inadequate pay. There simply wasn't enough time, enough manpower, enough budget to give every case the attention it deserved. But resources alone don't explain why the Popkov case went unsolved for so long. The bigger problem was who the victims were. Many of them were sex workers, women who sold their bodies to survive in the brutal economic landscape of post-Soviet Russia. Others were women who drank, who went to parties, who violated traditional norms of feminine behavior. In the minds of many investigators, these women had put themselves at risk. They'd made bad choices. They'd lived dangerous lives. And while their deaths were unfortunate, they weren't treated with the same urgency as murders of respectable women. This bias is documented in how cases were investigated, or more accurately, how they weren't. When a sex worker was found murdered, the investigation might consist of a few interviews with other sex workers who knew her, a cursory examination of the crime scene, and then the case would go cold. There was no intensive manhunt, no massive deployment of resources, no public appeals for information. The attitude seemed to be, this is what happens when you live that kind of life. This institutional bias gave Popkov enormous advantages. He understood, either consciously or instinctively, that targeting marginalized women would give him more time, more freedom to operate. And he was careful in other ways too. He varied his dump sites, never establishing too obvious a pattern. He varied his methods slightly, using different weapons, though the core signature of extreme violence remained consistent. He was smart enough to avoid leaving obvious evidence. As a police officer, he knew what investigators looked for. He knew how to avoid the most common mistakes. But there were clues. There were always clues. Investigators examining multiple crime scenes noticed similar tire tracks appearing again and again. The tracks belonged to a Lada Niva, that distinctive four-wheel drive vehicle. This was actually a significant lead, because Nivas weren't as common as standard cars. They were expensive, utilitarian vehicles typically used by police, security services, military, or people who needed serious off-road capability. This meant the killer likely had some connection to law enforcement or security work. This lead was documented in case files. Investigators knew about it, but it wasn't pursued with the intensity it deserved. Why? Possibly because following that lead meant suspecting cops, and nobody wanted to do that. Police departments are insular communities. Cops look out for each other. The idea that one of their own could be a serial killer was difficult to even contemplate, let alone actively investigate. And then there was Svetlana's testimony in 1998, a survivor who described her attacker in detail, a police officer driving a Lada Niva. She gave them everything. A description of the vehicle, a description of the attacker's appearance and build, details about his methods. It was concrete, actionable intelligence from someone who'd survived an encounter with the killer. The police took her statement, they wrote it all down, and then they did almost nothing with it. Some investigators thought her head injuries had scrambled her memories. Others simply didn't want to believe that a cop could be responsible. When they did approach Mikhail Popkov about the allegations, asking routine questions, his wife Alina provided an alibi. He was home with me that night. He couldn't have done this. And the investigation stalled. Svetlana's testimony was filed away. The case went cold, and Mikhail Popkov continued killing. One of the most chilling details that would emerge during Popkov's eventual trial was his willingness to kill people connected to his own life. This wasn't some abstract predator hunting strangers in a distant city. This was a man who murdered people his family knew, people his daughter interacted with, and then went home and played the role of concerned father without missing a beat. In 2000, Popkov murdered a music teacher who worked at his daughter Ekaterina's school. We don't know her name, It's been withheld to protect the family's privacy, but we know she existed. We know she taught children, including Ekaterina. We know she was dedicated to her work, that parents trusted her with their kids, that students looked up to her. And we know that Mikhail Popkov picked her up one night, drove her to a remote location, and murdered her with the same extreme violence he'd shown all his other victims. He dumped her body in the forest along with another victim, leaving them to be found days or weeks later. And then he went home to his family. When the teacher's disappearance was noticed, when it became clear something had happened to her, Ekaterina's school was thrown into chaos. Students were confused, scared, asking questions that administrators couldn't answer. Parents were worried, wondering if their children were safe, if something terrible had happened. And when the body was finally discovered and identified, when the news spread that the beloved music teacher had been murdered, the school community was devastated. The school organized a fundraiser to help cover funeral expenses. This was common in Russia in the early 2000s, when many families couldn't afford proper burials and communities would chip in to help. Students were asked to contribute what they could, bringing money from home to donate. Ekaterina Popkov went to her father and asked for money. Her teacher had been killed. It was so sad, so tragic. Could he please give her something to contribute? She wanted to help, wanted to do something meaningful in response to this terrible thing that had happened. And Mikhail Popkov, the man who'd murdered that teacher, looked his daughter in the eye and reached for his wallet. He pulled out bills, handed them to Ekaterina, told her it was good that the school was doing this, that it was important to honor the dead properly. He played the role of caring father, concerned citizen, upstanding member of the community. And his daughter, trusting and innocent, had no idea she was holding money that her father was giving her to help bury a woman he'd killed. The compartmentalization required for that moment is almost beyond comprehension. The sheer psychological disconnection needed to murder someone your child knows, to go home and interact with that child normally, to then participate in the mourning process by giving your daughter money for the funeral. It suggests a level of dissociation that's difficult for normal people to even imagine. But this is what serial killers like Popkov do. They don't exist in a constant state of bloodlust. They're not perpetually violent or obviously disturbed. They're capable of switching between different identities, different modes of being with terrifying fluidity. In the morning, he's a loving father making breakfast for his daughter. By evening, he's a monster hunting victims. Later that night, he's back to being a normal person, sleeping peacefully beside his wife. Each identity is genuine in its own way, or at least performed with such conviction that it becomes indistinguishable from genuine. This is why people who knew Popkov struggled so much when his crimes were finally revealed. The Mikhail they knew wasn't a lie exactly. That version of him really existed. He really was a father who drove his daughter to music lessons. He really was a cop who showed up for his shifts and did his job. But those versions of Mikhail coexisted with another version, the predator, the killer, the monster. And that version was just as real. Svetlana wasn't the only woman who escaped from Mikhail Popkov, though she may be the only one who reported it to police immediately. Another survivor was 18-year-old Evgenia Protasova. The details of her attack are fragmentary, pieced together from brief references in court documents and news reports, but what we know is harrowing enough. Popkov attacked Evgenia with his usual extreme violence. He beat her with a branch, a weapon of opportunity rather than something he'd brought specifically. He strangled her until she lost consciousness, probably assuming she was dead or would die shortly from her injuries. And then, in an act of particular cruelty, he stripped her completely naked and left her body in the Siberian wilderness in the middle of January. Let that sink in for a moment. Naked, in Siberia, in January, when temperatures regularly drop to -20 or -30 Fahrenheit. Even if someone survived the attack itself, exposure would kill them within hours, maybe faster. Hypothermia would set in almost immediately. The body would shut down, organs failing one by one as the core temperature plummeted. It would be an agonizing death. Popkov left Evgenia there to die. He drove away, probably confident that even if someone found her, she'd be long dead by then. But somehow, impossibly, Evgenia regained consciousness. How long she'd been lying there we don't know. Long enough for hypothermia to set in. Long enough for her body temperature to drop to dangerous levels. She tried to move but couldn't. Her muscles wouldn't respond. She lost consciousness again, her body shutting down from the combination of trauma and cold. By any reasonable standard, she should have died there. The odds of survival were virtually zero. But a retired couple happened to be taking a walk in that area. Why they were there, what brought them to that specific location at that specific time, we don't know. Call it luck, call it fate, call it divine intervention if you're inclined that way. But they found her. They saw a naked woman lying in the snow and immediately understood this was an emergency. They called an ambulance. When Evgenia arrived at the hospital, doctors weren't sure she'd make it. She had severe hypothermia. She had traumatic injuries from the beating. She'd been strangled to the point of unconsciousness, possibly causing brain damage. But she survived. She lived. Another woman who'd encountered Mikhail Popkov and managed to walk away, though walk away is perhaps too optimistic a phrase. She carried permanent damage, physical and psychological, from what he'd done to her. Whether Evgenia went to police, whether she reported the attack, whether her testimony was taken seriously, we don't know. Her story doesn't appear in the main narrative of the investigation in the same way Svetlana's does, but she survived. And her survival is a testament to the sheer will to live that some people possess, the refusal to give up even when every rational indicator says death is inevitable. These survivors, Svetlana and Evgenia and perhaps others we don't know about, they're crucial to understanding the full scope of Popkov's crimes. Because for every woman he killed, there were probably others who escaped, who fought back successfully, who got lucky. But those escapes didn't stop him. He just found new victims. The hunger, the compulsion, whatever drove him to kill, it was too strong to be deterred by occasional failures. Throughout the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Mikhail Popkov continued his reign of terror. Bodies kept appearing. Investigations kept going nowhere. Families kept losing daughters, sisters, mothers, and getting no answers, no justice, no closure. Some victims were found quickly, their bodies discovered within days of their murders. Others lay hidden for months or years, their remains finally stumbled upon by hikers or hunters or people walking their dogs in the forest. By the time some bodies were found, they were too decomposed for visual identification. Forensic analysis was limited. DNA technology existed but wasn't widely used in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s. Many victims were never identified, buried as Jane does, mourned by no one because no one knew who they were. Popkov's victim selection revealed his twisted psychology. He later claimed he was targeting immoral women, sex workers and women who drank and women who went out alone at night. Women who, in his diseased mind, were like his alcoholic mother. Women who violated his rigid sense of how women should behave. He was, he insisted, cleansing the streets, making society better by removing these women. It's a justification we see in other serial killers, this delusion that they're performing some kind of service, that their murders serve a higher purpose. It allows them to see themselves not as monsters but as vigilantes, moral crusaders, agents of justice. It's narcissistic and delusional and utterly divorced from reality, but it's how they rationalize their actions to themselves. But Popkov didn't only kill marginalized women. Some of his victims were just ordinary people in the wrong place at the wrong time. Women walking home after visiting friends. Women who'd missed the last bus. Women who made the perfectly reasonable decision to accept a ride from a police officer. Because why wouldn't you trust a cop? One chilling detail that emerged from Popkov's confessions was his encounter with one victim who survived his initial attack. In 2000, he murdered two women, Maria Lizhina, 35 years old, and Lilia Pashkovskaya, 37 years old. He left their bodies in the forest. But then he realized he'd dropped something at the scene, a police identity token that had fallen from his pocket during the attacks. He panicked. If investigators found that token, it would lead directly to him. His carefully maintained double life would collapse. So he went back to retrieve it, probably the next day, driving back to the remote location where he dumped the bodies. When he arrived, he found the token quickly, crisis averted. But then he noticed something that shocked him. One of the women was still breathing. Despite her horrific injuries, despite being left for dead in the freezing forest, she was somehow still alive. Popkov later described his reaction in leaked interrogation testimony. "I was shocked by the fact that she was still alive." So he picked up a shovel and beat her to death, finishing what he'd started. The casualness of this confession is almost more disturbing than the violence itself. There's no emotion in how he describes it, no recognition that he's recounting something monstrous. It's just a problem he needed to solve, a loose end that needed tying up. She was still alive, so I killed her. Said with the same tone someone might use to describe fixing a leaky faucet or taking out the trash. This absence of empathy, this complete disconnection from normal human emotion, is what allowed Popkov to kill 91 times. Most people couldn't commit one murder without being psychologically devastated. The guilt, the horror of what they'd done, it would eat them alive. But Popkov killed over and over and over and then went home and slept soundly. He wasn't haunted by his victims. He wasn't tormented by guilt. He was satisfied. By the mid-2000s, Russian investigators knew they had a serial killer in Angarsk. The pattern was undeniable. Multiple women murdered in similar ways, bodies dumped in similar locations, a clear signature of extreme violence. But despite knowing they were dealing with a serial killer, despite having some solid leads, the investigation continued to founder. Part of the problem was bureaucratic. Russian law enforcement in the 2000s was still struggling with many of the same issues that had plagued it in the 90s. Underfunding, understaffing, inadequate training in modern investigative techniques. Different jurisdictions didn't communicate well with each other. When bodies were found in different regions, even neighboring ones, the cases might not be connected because there was no centralized database tracking patterns. But the bigger problem was the Lada-Neva connection. Investigators had documented tire tracks at multiple crime scenes. They knew those tracks belonged to a Neva. They knew Nevas were typically used by law enforcement and security services. This meant the suspect pool could be narrowed significantly. In Angarsk and the surrounding region, there were maybe a few thousand people who fit the profile. Male, appropriate age range, access to a Neva, possibly employed in law enforcement or security. But following that lead aggressively would mean investigating cops. It would mean treating their colleagues as potential serial killer suspects. And nobody wanted to do that. Police culture is intensely tribal. Cops protect each other. They give each other the benefit of the doubt. The idea that one of their own could be responsible for these murders was not just uncomfortable, it was almost unthinkable. So the Neva lead was documented but not pursued with appropriate intensity. Investigators looked at other possibilities. Maybe the killer had stolen a police vehicle. Maybe he'd bought a used Neva from law enforcement surplus. Maybe the tire tracks were misleading, contamination from police vehicles that had arrived at crime scenes after the murders. Meanwhile, Svetlana's 1998 testimony sat in a file somewhere, gathering dust. A survivor had literally told them the killer was a cop driving a Neva, and the information had been dismissed. How many lives could have been saved if that testimony had been taken seriously? If investigators had assembled a list of all police officers in the region who owned or had access to Nevas and systematically investigated each one. We'll never know the exact number, but it's certainly dozens. This failure haunts everyone connected to the case. The detectives who worked on it, the families who lost loved ones, the survivors who tried to warn authorities because the clues were there. The information existed. The investigation could have succeeded years earlier, but institutional biases, resource limitations, and a reluctance to suspect police officers allowed Popkov to continue killing. There's also the issue of how marginalized victims affected investigation priority. When a sex worker was murdered, when a woman known to drink heavily was found dead, these cases didn't generate the same level of urgency as other murders. They were filed as low priority. Resources were allocated elsewhere. And in an environment where police were already overwhelmed with cases, low priority meant the investigation might consist of nothing more than a few perfunctory interviews and a file that went straight into a box marked unsolved. This is a pattern we see in serial killer cases worldwide. The Yorkshire Ripper in England operated for years partly because his early victims were sex workers and police didn't prioritize those cases. Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer in the United States, targeted sex workers and runaways specifically because he knew those victims wouldn't generate intensive investigations. Robert Pickton in Canada murdered dozens of women from Vancouver's downtown East Side, marginalized women whose disappearances were ignored for years. Society's tendency to devalue certain lives creates hunting grounds for predators. When we decide that some people matter less, when we allocate fewer resources to investigating their deaths, we're essentially giving serial killers permission to target those populations. And that's exactly what Popkov did. Sometime around 2010, Mikhail Popkov stopped killing, or at least his active murder spree appears to have ended. No more bodies appeared with his distinctive signature of extreme violence. No more women disappeared under circumstances matching his pattern. For the first time in 18 years, the streets of Angarsk were safe from the predator who'd hunted there for so long. Why did he stop? Popkov later claimed he contracted a venereal disease from one of his victims, a condition that left him impotent. Since his crimes involved SA as well as murder, the loss of erectile function would have made it impossible for him to continue his pattern. That's his explanation, at least. But is it true? We have no way to verify his claim about the disease, and there are other possible explanations for why he stopped. Age might have been a factor. Popkov was in his mid-40s by 2010. Maybe his drive diminished. Maybe the physical demands of the violence became harder to sustain. Maybe he was simply tired. Or maybe he sensed the net closing in. DNA technology was becoming more advanced and more widely used in Russia by the late 2000s. Cold cases were being reopened with new forensic techniques. Maybe Popkov, with his insider's knowledge of police work, understood that continuing to kill was becoming too risky. The methods that had protected him for 18 years might not work anymore. Whatever the reason, the killing spree ended. But the bodies he'd left behind, the evidence scattered across dozens of crime scenes, the DNA stored in evidence lockers, all of it remained, waiting. And advances in forensic science were about to change everything. 2012. 20 years after Mikhail Popkov committed his first murder. 2 decades of killing, of bodies piling up, of investigations going nowhere, of families destroyed by unanswered questions. And finally, someone decided to try a different approach. Russian investigators, likely frustrated by the mountain of unsolved cases in the Angarsk region, made the decision to reopen cold cases using DNA technology. The science had advanced dramatically since the 1990s. Testing that would have taken weeks and cost enormous amounts of money could now be done in days at reasonable expense. Evidence that had been collected years ago and stored in evidence lockers could finally be analyzed properly. A special investigative team was assembled, led by a detective named Olga Likodeva. Her task was to focus specifically on unsolved murders of women in the Angarsk and Irkutsk region, to look for patterns, to use modern forensic science to find connections that earlier investigators had missed. The team started pulling evidence from dozens of cases, biological samples from crime scenes, swabs, hair, bodily fluids, anything that might contain DNA. They began running analysis, comparing samples against each other, and they discovered something crucial. The same male DNA appeared at scene after scene after scene. Multiple murders spanning years, all linked to the same perpetrator. They were dealing with a serial killer who'd been operating for at least a decade, possibly longer. Now they just had to find him. But how do you find someone when all you have is DNA? You need something to compare it against, and that meant collecting samples from suspects. Investigators compiled a list of potential suspects based on various factors. Age, they were looking for a man probably in his 30s to 50s. Location, someone who lived or worked in Angarsk or the surrounding region. Access to a Lada Niva vehicle, since those tire tracks kept appearing at crime scenes. Employment in law enforcement or security, because the Niva connection suggested someone in that world. And anyone who'd been flagged in earlier investigations. Anyone whose name had come up even tangentially in connection with the murders. The list was enormous, approximately 3,500 names, 3,500 men who fit some or all of the criteria. It was a staggering number of people to test, but investigators were determined. They had the technology now. They had the resources, or at least more resources than they'd had in the 1990s. And they had a clear goal: test everyone on the list, compare their DNA to the crime scene evidence, find the match. The process took months. Investigators had to locate each person on the list. Some had moved away from the region. Some had died. Some were in prison for other crimes. Each person had to be convinced or compelled to provide a DNA sample. Consent was requested, but if someone refused, warrants could be obtained. Swabs were collected, submitted to labs, analyzed, compared to the crime scene database. One by one, names were eliminated. Not a match, not a match, not a match. Mikhail Popkov's name was on that list. He'd been a police officer in Angarsk during the relevant time period. He owned a Lada Niva. He fit the general profile, but so did hundreds of other men. There was no particular reason to suspect him more than anyone else, until his DNA was tested. The match was unmistakable, conclusive, scientifically certain. The DNA found at multiple murder scenes, murders spanning years and demonstrating a clear pattern, belonged to Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, former police officer, husband, father, upstanding member of the community, the man everyone thought they knew. June 23, 2012. Investigators brought Mikhail Popkov in for questioning. They didn't tell him immediately that they had his DNA. That's standard interrogation technique. You want to see how the suspect behaves, what stories they tell, whether they try to explain away their connection to the crimes before they even know you have evidence against them. Popkov was 48 years old at this point, 2 years into what appeared to be retirement from his killing career. He'd been living a quiet life, still married to Alina, still involved in his daughter Ekaterina's life, still the same ordinary guy his neighbors had always known. And now he was sitting in an interrogation room, facing detectives who suspected him of serial murder. What happened next shocked even the experienced investigators conducting the interview. Before they showed him the DNA evidence, before they even accused him directly of any specific murders, Mikhail Popkov confessed. Not to one murder, not to 2 or 3, to 22 murders. The detectives were stunned. They'd been planning to charge him with maybe 3 or 4 murders based on the DNA evidence they had. But 22? That was beyond anything they'd anticipated. And as the interrogation continued, as Popkov provided details that only the killer could know, it became clear he wasn't lying or exaggerating. He was confessing to actual murders, providing information about victims, locations, methods that matched unsolved cases investigators had been working for years. Why did he confess so readily? Psychologists have debated this. Maybe he felt relief at finally being caught, at no longer having to maintain his exhausting double life. Maybe he wanted recognition, wanted to be known as one of Russia's most prolific killers, wanted his accomplishments acknowledged. Maybe he enjoyed reliving the murders through his confessions, getting one last taste of satisfaction from recounting his crimes. Or maybe, after 20 years of carrying these secrets alone, Part of him simply wanted to tell someone, to unburden himself, to explain what he'd done. As the confessions continued over the following days and weeks, a picture emerged of Popkov's psychology and his justifications. He told investigators he'd been cleansing the streets. He claimed he targeted prostitutes and women he deemed immoral, women who reminded him of his alcoholic, allegedly abusive mother. Women who drank, who went out at night, who violated his rigid sense of proper female behavior. He was, in his diseased mind, performing a service, ridding society of these undesirable women. He also made false accusations against his wife Alina, claiming she'd been unfaithful, that her alleged infidelity had triggered his violence. There was no evidence whatsoever that Alina had ever been unfaithful, and she vehemently denied it. This was Popkov trying to shift blame, trying to position himself as a victim driven to violence by circumstances beyond his control rather than the predatory monster he actually was. Psychiatrists were brought in to evaluate Popkov's mental state. This is standard procedure in Russia for serious crimes. The question wasn't whether he was mentally ill. Almost everyone who commits serial murder has some psychological abnormality. The question was whether he was legally sane, capable of understanding the nature and consequences of his actions, able to control his behavior. The psychiatrists found Popkov legally sane. He understood right from wrong. He knew killing was illegal. He knew society condemned his actions. He did it anyway, repeatedly, for nearly 2 decades, because he wanted to, because he chose to, because the satisfaction he derived from the violence outweighed any moral considerations. This finding was crucial for prosecution. If Popkov had been found legally insane, he would have been committed to a psychiatric facility rather than sent to prison. But the psychiatric evaluation confirmed what investigators had already suspected. This wasn't a man driven to kill by uncontrollable delusions or psychotic episodes. This was a calculating predator who understood exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. Forensic psychiatrist Alexander Grishin, who examined Popkov, noted something particularly chilling in his interviews. Popkov showed no remorse for his crimes. He expressed regret about being caught, yes. He was concerned about how his family would react, worried about his reputation, bothered by the thought of spending the rest of his life in prison. But genuine remorse for the suffering he'd caused his victims, empathy for the families he'd destroyed, understanding of the magnitude of harm he'd inflicted. None. Those emotional capacities simply didn't exist in him, or if they did, they were so deeply buried that no amount of questioning could access them. This absence of empathy is a hallmark of psychopathy, and it's what allowed Popkov to kill so many times without psychological breakdown. Most people couldn't murder even once without being devastated by guilt, but Popkov killed 91 times at least and slept soundly afterward. He wasn't haunted. He wasn't tormented. He was satisfied. January 2015. Nearly 3 years after his arrest, Mikhail Popkov finally went on trial. The delay was typical for the Russian legal system, especially for a case this complex. Prosecutors needed time to build their case, to organize evidence spanning multiple murders, to coordinate testimony from forensic experts, investigators, and family members of victims. Defense attorneys needed time to review the evidence, though in this case there wasn't much they could argue. Popkov had confessed. The DNA evidence was conclusive. The question wasn't guilt or innocence. The question was only sentencing. The trial was held in Irkutsk, the regional capital. Popkov was charged with 22 murders, the ones he'd confessed to and that prosecutors felt they had the strongest evidence for. More charges would come later as investigators continued to link him to additional crimes, but these 22 were the beginning. Russian courtrooms have a distinctive feature. Defendants are held in metal cages during trials. It's meant to prevent escapes or violent outbursts, but it also creates a powerful visual. Popkov sat in that cage throughout the proceedings, listening as prosecutors laid out the horrific details of his crimes, as forensic experts explained the DNA evidence, as investigators recounted his confessions. He pleaded guilty to all 22 murders. There was no point denying them. The evidence was overwhelming. His own words had condemned him. But pleading guilty doesn't mean you automatically get a reduced sentence in the Russian system. The trial still had to proceed, evidence still had to be presented, the full scope of the crimes still had to be documented for the record. The courtroom heard details that were almost too horrible to process. Prosecutors described the extreme violence Popkov had inflicted on his victims. Medical examiners testified about the nature of the wounds, the brutality of the attacks. Some victims had been beaten so severely their faces were unrecognizable. Some had been mutilated with axes or hammers. Some had been strangled, stabbed, bludgeoned. The variety of weapons and methods spoke to someone who wasn't following a rigid script, but rather adapting his violence to circumstances, using whatever tools were available, expressing his rage in whatever form felt right in the moment. Families of victims attended the trial. Many had waited years, some more than a decade, for answers about what happened to their loved ones. Now they sat in the courtroom, listening to prosecutors describe in clinical detail how their daughters, sisters, mothers had died. It was excruciating. Some family members wept openly. Others sat in stony silence, their faces masks of controlled rage. A few had to leave the courtroom, unable to bear hearing the specifics of how their loved ones had suffered. During victim impact statements, family members were given the opportunity to address the court, to describe what Popkov's crimes had cost them. These testimonies were heartbreaking. Mothers described the day they realized their daughter was never coming home, the years spent hopping for a call that never came, the hollow feeling of burying a child. Siblings talked about growing up with an empty chair at the dinner table, about family gatherings that would forever feel incomplete. Partners spoke about lives frozen in place, about the inability to move forward because part of them was still waiting, still hopping, even years after they knew intellectually that their loved one was dead. Children who'd grown up without mothers gave testimony that was particularly devastating. They described growing up wondering where their mother had gone, why she'd left them, eventually learning she hadn't left but had been taken, murdered, discarded. They talked about the milestones she'd missed, graduations, weddings, the birth of grandchildren she'd never meet. They described the anger they felt not just at Popkov, but at a system that had failed to catch him sooner, that had allowed him to continue killing for years after the evidence was there. Popkov showed minimal reaction to these statements. He sat in his cage, staring ahead, his face mostly blank. Occasionally he'd look down at his hands or shift position, but he didn't weep, didn't show visible signs of remorse or guilt. If the family's pain affected him emotionally, he gave no indication of it. That indifference was its own form of cruelty, one final insult to the people whose lives he'd destroyed. His defense attorneys did what they could with an essentially unwinnable case. They argued that Popkov's troubled childhood, his abusive alcoholic mother, had created psychological damage that contributed to his crimes. They brought in their own psychiatric experts to suggest that, while Popkov was legally sane, he was still deeply damaged, still someone whose capacity for normal human connection had been broken by early trauma. They asked the court to consider these mitigating factors in sentencing. But prosecutors countered effectively. Millions of people experience childhood trauma and don't become serial killers. Popkov's past might explain certain psychological patterns, but it didn't excuse or justify 22 murders. He'd made choices, over and over again, for nearly 2 decades, to hunt and kill women. He'd done so while maintaining a facade of normalcy, which demonstrated he understood his actions were wrong and needed to be hidden. He was fully responsible for what he'd done. On January 23, 2015, the verdict came down. Mikhail Popkov was found guilty of all 22 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment in a maximum security penal colony. In the Russian system, life imprisonment means exactly that. There's no parole, no possibility of early release. Popkov would spend every remaining day of his life in a small cell, isolated from general prison population, his movements restricted, his freedoms stripped away. He would die in prison. He was transported to Penal Colony No. 56 in Nizhny Tagil, a facility known for harsh conditions and strict discipline. It's where Russia sends its worst offenders, the murderers and rapists and violent criminals society has decided must be permanently removed. Popkov would live there in a cell measuring a few square meters, eating minimal meals, performing assigned labor, spending 23 hours a day locked up with maybe 1 hour in an exercise yard. It's an existence designed to be punishing, deliberately stripped of comfort or pleasure. For someone like Popkov, it was the only appropriate response. But even as Popkov began serving his sentence, investigators weren't done. They had DNA evidence linking him to many more crime scenes, dozens more unsolved murders, and they were determined to get justice for every single victim, to document every single crime, to ensure that Popkov's full scope of destruction was officially recognized. Life in a Russian prison is brutal by design. The cells are small, cold, austere. Food is minimal, just enough to sustain life. Contact with the outside world is severely limited. For someone like Popkov, who'd spent decades living a double life, who'd been able to move freely, to hunt at will, to maintain the appearance of normalcy, prison must have been a shocking adjustment. But in some ways, prison might have also been a relief. No more maintaining the facade. No more pretending to be a normal person while hiding monstrous compulsions. No more fear of being caught because he'd already been caught. For the first time in 20 years, Popkov could be fully honest about who he was and what he'd done. And he wanted to talk. Over the following months and years, Popkov continued confessing to murders. Detectives would visit him in prison, bringing case files, showing him photos of crime scenes and victims, asking if he recognized them, if he was responsible. And over he'd say yes. Yes, I killed her. Yes, that was me. Let me tell you what happened. By 2017, 2 years into his life sentence, Popkov had confessed to 59 additional murders beyond the 22 he'd already been convicted of. 59. Combined with his previous convictions, that brought his total victim count to 81. 81 women murdered over 18 years. The number was staggering, almost incomprehensible. It made him one of the most prolific serial killers in world history, surpassing Andrei Chikatilo's 52 confirmed murders to become Russia's deadliest serial killer in modern times. The confessions included murders spanning from 1992, when he committed his first kill, all the way to 2010, when he apparently stopped. Nearly 2 decades of sustained violence, of hunting and killing, of destroying lives and families. The geographical scope was primarily Angarsk and the surrounding Irkutsk region, but Popkov had occasionally ventured further afield, killing in neighboring areas when opportunity presented itself. Some of the murders he confessed to had never been officially connected to the serial killer case. They were filed as isolated incidents, one-off crimes, maybe even accidents or suicides. Investigators had to go back and re-examine these cases, comparing Popkov's confessions against evidence, verifying that what he was telling them matched the facts. In most cases, it did. The details he provided, details that were never publicly released and that only the killer would know, confirmed he was telling the truth. Why did he confess so extensively? Psychologists who studied the case suggested several possibilities. Some serial killers seek recognition, wanting their accomplishments acknowledged, wanting to be known as one of the worst, the most prolific, the most successful. Popkov might have been motivated by this desire for notoriety. If he was going to spend the rest of his life in prison anyway, at least he could ensure his place in criminal history. Others suggested he was reliving the murders through his confessions, getting one final taste of satisfaction by recounting each kill, by remembering the faces of his victims, the feeling of power and control he'd experienced. Each confession was a chance to revisit those moments, to experience them again vicariously through memory and description. Or maybe, more simply, he was cooperating because he knew it might earn him better treatment in prison. While he couldn't get out of his life sentence, cooperation with authorities could mean small improvements to his conditions: better food, slightly more recreation time, access to books or other materials. These things might seem trivial to people on the outside, but in the grinding monotony of prison life, any small improvement matters enormously. Whatever his motivations, the confessions provided investigators with crucial information. They allowed dozens of cold cases to be closed. They gave families answers about what had happened to their loved ones. They helped locate remains that might never have been discovered otherwise. Each confession represented closure for another family, another victim finally getting justice, another piece of Popkov's full criminal legacy being documented for history. January 2018. Mikhail Popkov went on trial again, this time for the 59 additional murders he'd confessed to while in prison. The trial was held in the same Irkutsk regional court where he'd been convicted 3 years earlier. He sat in the same steel cage, wearing the same prison uniform, facing the same kind of prosecutors who'd put him away the first time. This trial lasted nearly a year, much longer than the first. The sheer number of charges, 59 separate murders each requiring its own presentation of evidence, made for a lengthy proceeding. Prosecutors had to methodically go through each case, presenting DNA evidence where it existed, showing how Popkov's confessions matched details of the crimes, bringing in forensic experts to verify that what he'd told them was consistent with physical evidence. The courtroom once again heard horrifying testimony about the brutality of Popkov's attacks. New details emerged about murders that hadn't been discussed in the first trial. Prosecutors presented evidence of the variety of weapons he'd used: axes, hammers, knives, screwdrivers, baseball bats, even improvised weapons like branches or rocks grabbed in the moment. The violence was excessive, far beyond what was necessary to kill. It spoke to someone expressing rage, hatred, a need to not just end lives but to destroy bodies, to obliterate. More families attended this trial, families who'd only recently learned that their missing loved ones had been Popkov's victims. Some had been waiting a decade or more for answers. Others had given up hope years ago, had held memorial services for people whose bodies were never found, had tried to move on with their lives while carrying the weight of not knowing. Now they finally had answers, but those answers brought new pain. One of the most emotionally powerful moments came when Svetlana, the survivor from 1998, testified. She was now in her mid-30s, nearly 20 years older than when Popkov had attacked her. She'd lived most of her adult life with the physical and psychological scars he'd inflicted: the permanent stutter, the neurological damage that affected her motor control, the gray hair that marked her as someone who'd aged beyond her years, the nightmares that still woke her up decades later. She walked into that courtroom, saw Popkov sitting in his cage, and her body betrayed her. "I lost the ability to walk again the second I saw him. Her legs simply stopped working. Court officers had to help her, physically support her, get her to the witness stand. The trauma came flooding back with such force that her body shut down involuntarily." But she testified. Through tears, through the stutter that made speaking difficult, through visible trembling, she told her story. She described the attack in 1998. She described going to police immediately afterward, giving them descriptions, providing details that should have led to Popkov's arrest years earlier. She described not being believed, being dismissed, being told her head injuries had made her confused. And she looked directly at the prosecutors and said, "If you had listened to me in 1998, how many of these women would still be alive?" It was a question that haunted everyone in that courtroom. If Svetlana had been believed, if her testimony had been taken seriously, if investigators had followed up aggressively on her description of a police officer driving a Lada Niva, if they'd compiled a list of suspects and systematically investigated each one, if they'd done their jobs properly, how many women would have been saved? The answer is dozens. Popkov killed for 12 more years after Svetlana's attack. If he'd been arrested in 1998 or 1999, if proper investigation had followed her testimony, at least half of his eventual 91 victims would still be alive. They'd be mothers, grandmothers, professionals, friends, members of their communities. Instead, they're statistics in a serial killer's tally, names on a list of the dead, holes in families that will never be filled. Svetlana's testimony was a devastating indictment not just of Popkov, but of the system that had failed her and all the subsequent victims. It highlighted how institutional biases, how reluctance to suspect police officers, how dismissal of certain witnesses, how all of these factors combined to enable a predator to continue operating long after he should have been caught. The second trial also featured testimony from Evgenia, the other known survivor. She described her attack, being beaten with a branch, being strangled until she lost consciousness, waking up naked in the freezing wilderness and somehow surviving. Her testimony was shorter than Svetlana's, less detailed but equally powerful. She'd nearly died. She'd been left for dead, and only luck or fate or divine intervention had saved her. Family members gave victim impact statements again, many of them people who hadn't been part of the first trial because their loved ones were only recently connected to Popkov. The testimony was similar to what the first trial had heard. Mothers describing unbearable loss, siblings talking about growing up in the shadow of murder, children explaining what it meant to grow up without a parent. But hearing it again, hearing it from dozens more families, emphasized the sheer scope of destruction Popkov had caused. One woman, whose mother had been murdered by Popkov in 2003, described growing up essentially orphaned. Her father had abandoned the family years earlier, and her mother was all she had. When Popkov killed her mother, when this 8-year-old girl lost the only parent she'd ever known, she was shuttled between relatives who didn't really want her, bounced through the Russian social services system, eventually aging out of state care with minimal support. Her entire life trajectory had been altered by Popkov's actions. She should have grown up loved, supported, with opportunities and possibilities. Instead, she'd grown up alone, struggling, damaged. How do you quantify that kind of harm? How do you assign a punishment that adequately reflects destroying not just one life, but the ripple effects that extend outward to touch dozens or hundreds of other lives? A child grows up without a mother, and that affects their education, their relationships, their mental health, their own parenting when they have children. The harm doesn't stop with the victim. It cascades forward through time, affecting generations. Throughout all this testimony, Popkov remained largely impassive. He sat in his cage, occasionally taking notes, sometimes conferring quietly with his attorneys but showing minimal emotional reaction. If he felt remorse, guilt, empathy for the suffering he'd caused, it didn't show. His face remained a mask. The trial dragged on for months. In addition to the victim testimony and evidence presentation, there were legal arguments about specific charges, debates about whether certain murders could be conclusively proven, discussions of sentencing guidelines and aggravating factors. Russian trials can be exhaustive processes, especially for cases of this magnitude. Finally, on December 10, 2018, the verdict came down. Mikhail Popkov was found guilty of 56 of the 59 murders he'd been charged with. The other 3 cases had insufficient evidence for conviction, problems with forensic analysis or gaps in the chain of custody for evidence. But 56 additional convictions, combined with his previous 22, brought his official total to 78 confirmed murders. He was sentenced to a second life term to be served consecutively with his first. Legally, this was mostly symbolic. He was already serving life without parole. A second life sentence doesn't change his practical circumstances, but it was important symbolically, important for the record, important for the families. Each conviction represented a life taken, a victim officially recognized, justice finally served even if delayed by years or decades. Judge Vladimir Vysotsky, reading the verdict, described Popkov as one of the most terrible criminals in Russian history. He noted the extreme violence of the crimes, the sustained nature of the killing spree, the complete absence of remorse. He called Popkov a danger to society who must never be released under any circumstances. Popkov was returned to Penal Colony number 56, where he would spend the rest of his life. He was 54 years old at this point. Given average life expectancy for Russian men, especially those in harsh prison conditions, he might live another 20 years, maybe a bit more. 20 years in a small cell, eating minimal food, performing labor, isolated from humanity. 20 years to think about what he'd done, though given his apparent lack of remorse, he'd probably spend that time thinking about what he'd gotten away with for so long rather than regretting his actions. But even the second trial didn't mark the end of Popkov's confessions. From prison, he continued admitting to additional murders. It became almost routine. Investigators would visit him with cold case files. He'd review them. Sometimes he'd recognize a victim or a crime scene. Yes, that was me. I killed her. Here's what happened. In 2020, he confessed to 2 more murders. In 2021, another. These additional confessions were documented but didn't immediately trigger new trials. At some point, there's diminishing returns to continued prosecution. He's already serving 2 consecutive life sentences. He'll never be released. Whether he's officially convicted of 78 murders or 85 or 91 doesn't change his practical situation. But for investigators and families, each additional confession still mattered. Each one closed a cold case. Each one gave answers to families who'd been waiting years. Each one added to the historical record of exactly what Popkov had done. In November 2023, Popkov was formally charged with 3 additional murders. These cases had been investigated thoroughly enough to bring official charges, though whether they'd go to trial remained unclear. The charges brought his potential total to 81 officially recognized murders. And then in October 2025, just months ago from the present day in January 2026, prosecutors charged him with 2 more murders. That brings the confirmed total to 91. 91 women murdered over 18 years. It's a number almost too large to comprehend, almost abstract in its enormity. But each number is a person. Behind each statistic is a life that was lived and then taken. A woman who woke up on what she thought was an ordinary day, who made plans, who had thoughts and feelings and dreams, who interacted with people she loved, and then encountered Mikhail Popkov and died in terror and pain. Maria Lizhina was 35. Lilia Pashkovskaya was 37. We know their names because they were identified. But many of Popkov's victims remain nameless in public records, referred to only as victim number such and such, female, approximate age range, found at this location. Their families might know who they are, but the rest of us don't. They're ghosts, acknowledged but not truly known. Investigators believe there may be even more victims that haven't been discovered yet. The taiga forest around Angarsk is vast. Millions of square kilometers of dense woods where bodies could lie hidden for decades. Some of Popkov's victims might still be out there, skeletal remains slowly being reclaimed by the earth, their disappearances never officially connected to the serial killer who took their lives. As of January 2026, the case remains technically open. Any unsolved murders from the 1990s and 2000s in the Irkutsk region are potential Popkov victims. DNA analysis continues on old evidence. Investigators periodically visit Popkov in prison with new case files, and sometimes he confesses to more. Will we ever know the true total? Probably not. Popkov himself might not remember all his victims. 18 years of killing, possibly over 90 murders, that's a lot of individual crimes to keep track of. Some might have blurred together in his memory. Some he might not want to confess to for reasons only he understands. And some victims might simply never be found, their remains lost to time and the wilderness. But what we know for certain is that Mikhail Popkov is Russia's most prolific serial killer in modern history. He surpassed Andrei Chikatilo's 52 murders years ago. He ranks among the worst serial killers globally, up there with names like Luis Garavito, Pedro Lopez, Harold Shipman. The company he keeps is the most monstrous humanity has produced. While Mikhail Popkov sits in prison confessing to murder after murder, his family has been left to grapple with an impossible reality. The man they thought they knew never really existed. Or rather, he existed, but he coexisted with a monster, and they never saw the monster until it was too late. Alina Popkov, his wife of over 2 decades, initially struggled to accept the truth. When Mikhail was first arrested in 2012, Alina insisted he was innocent. There had been some mistake. The evidence was wrong. Her husband couldn't possibly be a serial killer. She knew him. She'd been married to him for years. She would have known if something was wrong. She provided him with alibis for some of the nights when murders occurred, claiming he'd been home with her. But as more and more evidence emerged, as Mikhail himself confessed to murder after murder, Alina's position became untenable. You can only deny reality for so long before it crushes you. She eventually divorced him, though the exact timing and circumstances aren't public. Alina largely disappeared from public view after the trials, understandably unwilling to speak to media about her life with a serial killer. The few brief statements she gave indicated she felt betrayed, horrified, unable to reconcile the man she'd married with the monster revealed in court. How do you process that kind of betrayal? How do you accept that the person you loved, the person you trusted with your life, the father of your child, was capable of murdering 91 women? That while you were sleeping beside him, he had blood on his hands? That while you were building a life together, he was destroying other people's lives? That every moment of normalcy, every family dinner, every shared laugh, every act of intimacy was happening alongside this other reality you never suspected? It breaks people. Alina will carry this for the rest of her life. She'll always be known as the serial killer's wife. People will always wonder if she really didn't know, if she suspected something but chose not to see it, if she was complicit in some way, even if only through willful blindness. Those questions will follow her forever, regardless of the truth. And what about Ekaterina, their daughter? She was in her 20s when her father was arrested, old enough to fully understand what he'd done, old enough to process the horror but perhaps not old enough to have the emotional tools to cope with it. One of her father's victims was her music teacher, a woman she'd seen every week, a woman who taught her, encouraged her, helped shape her education. And her father had murdered that teacher, then given Ekaterina money to help pay for the funeral. The psychological damage of that revelation alone is almost unfathomable. But it goes deeper. Every memory Ekaterina has of her childhood is now tainted. Her father driving her to music lessons, was that before or after he'd murdered someone? Her father helping with homework, had he killed that week? Family vacations, birthday parties, school events, all of it now carries this horrible context she didn't know existed at the time. And her sense of identity must be shattered. She's the daughter of Russia's worst serial killer. That's part of her identity now, whether she wants it or not. How does she explain that to people? How does she form relationships when this massive, dark secret sits at the center of her family history? How does she trust her own judgment about people when she completely failed to see what her own father was? Ekaterina has remained completely out of the public eye. There are no interviews with her, no statements, no public presence at all. She's chosen privacy, and given what she's been through, that's entirely understandable. But somewhere she's living with this burden. She's trying to build a life in the shadow of her father's monstrous crimes. She's probably in therapy, hopefully, trying to process trauma that most people can't even imagine. She's a victim too, not in the same way as the women her father killed, obviously. Her suffering doesn't compare to theirs, but she's still a victim, her life destroyed by learning who her father really was, and she has to live with that knowledge every single day for the rest of her life. The Popkov family is broken beyond repair. Elena and Ekaterina presumably have no contact with Mikhail. They've probably changed their names, though that's speculation. They're trying to rebuild lives that will never be whole again. And Mikhail sits in prison, apparently unconcerned with the devastation he's caused his own family, focused only on his own situation and his place in criminal history. Angarsk itself bears scars from Popkov's crimes. It's not a huge city, only about 250,000 people. When it came out that a local police officer had murdered at least 91 women over 18 years, when residents realized that for nearly 2 decades a monster had been hunting their streets, the psychological impact was profound. Trust in police, already shaky in Russia, was severely damaged. If you can't trust a cop, if the person wearing the uniform might be a serial killer, who can you trust? Crime reporting dropped in Angarsk after Popkov's arrest. People were less willing to call police, less willing to cooperate with investigations, because the fundamental social contract between law enforcement and community had been broken. Women especially felt the impact. The knowledge that Popkov had specifically targeted women, that he'd used his badge and uniform to lure victims, that he'd operated for so long without being caught, it created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Women in Angarsk became more cautious, more suspicious of offers of help, more aware of their vulnerability. And there's a layer of community guilt too. Popkov lived among them. He was their neighbor, their colleague, the guy they'd wave to on the street. Nobody suspected. Nobody saw. Does that make them complicit in some way? Rationally, of course not. Popkov was extraordinarily good at maintaining his facade. But emotionally, many residents of Angarsk struggle with the feeling that they should have known, should have seen something, should have done something. The forests around Angarsk, those beautiful taiga woods, are now associated with death. People who used to hike there for recreation think twice now. Every remote trail, every dense patch of trees could be hiding remains that haven't been discovered yet. The landscape itself feels haunted. And for families of victims who lived in Angarsk, the city is filled with painful memories. The bus stop where their daughter was last seen. The street she walked down before disappearing. The police station where they filed a missing persons report that went nowhere. These locations are constant reminders of loss, impossible to avoid in daily life. Some families moved away after their loved ones were murdered or after Popkov was finally caught. They couldn't bear to stay in a place with so many painful associations. But many stayed, either because they couldn't afford to move or because they felt leaving would be abandoning their loved one's memory. They live with the pain every day, seeing the places connected to their loss, unable to escape. Angarsk will probably always be known as the city where the werewolf hunted. That's its legacy now, fairly or not. When people hear the city's name, this is what they'll think of. Not the hardworking families or the industrial heritage or anything positive. Just the serial killer. Just the 91 dead women. Just the horror that unfolded there for 18 years. Even after 2 major trials, after dozens of confessions, after years of investigation, questions remain about Mikhail Popkov and his crimes. Why did he really stop killing in 2010? His claim about contracting a disease that left him impotent might be true, but we have no way to verify it. And even if it's true, was that really the only reason? Did he sense the net closing in? Did his urges diminish with age? Was he simply tired? We may never know the real answer. Were there accomplices? All evidence suggests Popkov acted alone, and all his confessions describe solo killings. But it's hard to believe someone could maintain such an extensive double life for so long without anyone noticing anything suspicious. Did people know but choose not to act? Did anyone help him, even unknowingly? The investigation found no evidence of accomplices, but the question lingers. Are there more victims we don't know about? Almost certainly yes. The 91 confirmed murders are just the cases investigators could conclusively link to Popkov through evidence or confession. But given the chaos of 1990s Russia, given how many of his victims were marginalized people whose disappearances might not have been reported, given the vast forests where bodies could remain hidden indefinitely, there are probably more. How many more? 10, 20, 50? We'll likely never know. Could he have been caught sooner? This is the question that haunts everyone involved in the case. If Svetlana had been believed in 1998, if the Lada Niva lead had been pursued more aggressively, if marginalized victims had been prioritized equally with other murder cases, if institutional biases hadn't prevented investigators from seriously suspecting police officers, if DNA technology had been implemented earlier. There were so many points where intervention could have stopped Popkov years before he was finally arrested. The answer is clearly yes, he could have been caught sooner, and that means many of his victims could have been saved. What was his wife Alina's real level of knowledge? She insists she didn't know, and there's no evidence she was aware of her husband's crimes. But could she really have been completely oblivious for 18 years? Did she never notice anything odd, never suspect anything? Or did she have suspicions she chose not to pursue, questions she chose not to ask? We'll probably never know the full truth. And finally, can we ever truly understand what made Popkov into a monster? We know about his troubled childhood, his alcoholic abusive mother, the psychological damage that created. We know about the cultural factors that shaped his worldview, his attitudes toward women, his sense of moral righteousness. We know about the opportunity his job provided, the access, the authority, the knowledge of how investigations work. But do all these factors add up to a complete explanation? Can we ever fully understand how an ordinary man becomes a serial killer who murders 91 people? Probably not. There's something in people like Popkov that resists complete explanation, something broken or missing or twisted that we can identify but not truly comprehend. What can we learn from the Mikhail Popkov case? What lessons emerge from this horror that might prevent future tragedies? First and most important, all victims matter equally. When society devalues certain lives, when sex workers and addicts and marginalized people are treated as less important, we create hunting grounds for predators. Popkov specifically targeted women he knew wouldn't generate intensive investigations. He was right about that calculation, and it allowed him to kill for 18 years. Every murder deserves a thorough investigation. Every missing person deserves to be searched for. Every life has equal value. Second, listen to survivors. Svetlana reported her attack in 1998 and gave investigators information that should have led to Popkov's arrest. She wasn't believed. Dozens of women died because her testimony was dismissed. Survivors provide crucial evidence. Their voices matter. Even if their testimony seems unreliable for whatever reason, it should be taken seriously and investigated thoroughly. Third, forensic technology saves lives. Popkov operated for 20 years using methods that worked fine in the analog age. DNA testing finally caught him in months. Investment in forensic science, training for investigators in new technologies, systematic application of DNA analysis to cold cases, all of this is essential for solving crimes and preventing future ones. Fourth, no one is above suspicion. Popkov was a cop, which made colleagues reluctant to suspect him. When evidence pointed toward law enforcement, there was resistance to following those leads. But in a murder investigation, profession and status can't create immunity from scrutiny. The evidence has to lead where it leads, even if that's uncomfortable. Fifth, institutional biases have deadly consequences. The dismissal of marginalized victims, the reluctance to suspect police officers, the gaps in interjurisdictional communication. All of these systemic problems enabled Popkov's crimes. Fixing these issues requires not just individual effort but institutional reform, changing policies and priorities and resource allocation. And finally, evil doesn't announce itself. Mikhail Popkov looked like everyone else. He was a neighbor, a colleague, a father. He maintained relationships, held down a job, functioned in society. The monsters aren't always obvious. They don't always look monstrous. Sometimes they're the person offering to help, wearing a uniform, smiling as they hold open a car door. We have to accept that danger can wear an ordinary face and adjust our vigilance accordingly. January 2026. Mikhail Popkov is 61 years old. He's been in prison for over 13 years, serving 2 consecutive life sentences in penal colony number 56. He'll never be released. He'll die in prison, alone, forgotten by everyone except the people whose lives he destroyed. Russian prisons aren't comfortable. Popkov lives in a small cell, eats minimal food, performs assigned labor, has strictly limited contact with the outside world. It's an existence designed to be punishing. And for someone like Popkov, for someone who took 91 lives, it's the only appropriate response. He continues to confess occasionally to additional murders. Whether there are more beyond the current 91, we don't know. Whether he remembers all his victims, we don't know. Whether he feels any genuine remorse after all these years, we don't know, though based on his previous psychological evaluations, probably not. The investigation remains technically open. Any unsolved murder from the 90s or 2000s in the Irkutsk region is a potential Popkov case. Evidence continues to be analyzed. Families continue to wonder if their missing loved ones might have been his victims. Svetlana is now in her early 40s. She's lived more than half her life with the physical and psychological damage Popkov inflicted. The permanent stutter, the neurological problems, the trauma that surfaces unexpectedly, but she survived. She testified. She told her story, and in doing so, she helped ensure justice for all the women who didn't survive. Evgenia similarly carries her scars, physical and emotional, from her brush with death. She's another survivor, another woman who looked into the abyss and somehow made it back. Elena and Ekaterina Popkov are somewhere living under different names, trying to build lives in the shadow of unimaginable family horror. They're victims too in their own way, forever marked by their connection to a monster. And the families of the 91 confirmed victims carry their grief forward. Some have found a measure of peace in the convictions, in knowing the person responsible has been punished. Others say no verdict can ever balance the scales, no sentence can truly serve as justice for what was taken from them. Both responses are valid. There's no correct way to process this kind of loss. Angarsk itself continues, its residents trying to move past the horror, though the city will probably always be associated with the werewolf. The forests around it still hold secrets, possibly more victims waiting to be discovered. And somewhere in those forests, in the dark places where Popkov dumped bodies, the earth slowly reclaims what's left. Bones returning to soil, evidence degrading, memory fading except among those who can never forget. Mikhail Viktorovich Popkov, born March 7, 1964, police officer, husband, father, and serial killer responsible for at least 91 confirmed murders, possibly more, making him Russia's most prolific serial killer in modern history. He operated for 18 years without being caught, from 1992 to 2010. He used his position as a police officer to gain victims' trust, offering rides to women in vulnerable situations, then driving them to remote locations and murdering them with extreme violence. He was a sexual sadist and necrophile who derived satisfaction from inflicting pain and death. He was caught in 2012 through DNA technology that didn't exist when he began killing. He confessed to dozens of murders and provided details that allowed investigators to close cold cases dating back decades. He was convicted in 2 major trials, sentenced to consecutive life terms, and will spend the rest of his life in prison. His victims were primarily women between the ages of 16 and 50, though most were in their 20s and 30s. Some were sex workers. Some were women who drank or went out alone at night. Some were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. They came from Angarsk and the surrounding Irkutsk region. Many were never identified. All are dead because of him. His crimes were enabled by systemic failures, institutional biases that devalued marginalized victims, reluctance to suspect police officers, limitations in forensic technology, gaps in interjurisdictional cooperation, and dismissal of survivor testimony. These failures meant that even when evidence pointed toward Popkov, even when survivors described him to police, the investigation failed to connect the dots until decades after his first murder. His crimes devastated his own family. His wife Alina, who divorced him and disappeared from public life. His daughter Ekaterina, who grew up not knowing her father was a monster and now has to live with that knowledge forever. And extended family members who carry the shame and horror of their connection to him. His crimes scarred Angarsk itself, a city that will forever be known as the place where the werewolf hunted, where 91 women lost their lives, where trust was shattered and community was broken. And his crimes joined the long, dark history of human evil, another entry in the catalog of monsters, another reminder that the worst things we can imagine are not just possible but real. But this story isn't ultimately about Mikhail Popkov. It's about the 91 women whose lives he stole. They're the ones who matter. They're the ones who should be remembered. We know some of their names: Maria Lizhina, Lilia Pashkovskaya, the music teacher whose name is withheld, and dozens of others documented in court records, their identities known to their families even if not to the public. But many remain nameless to us. Jane does. Unidentified female victims, numbers in case files. We don't know who they were, what they dreamed about, what they hoped for, what they feared. We don't know their stories because those stories were stolen from them before they could be fully told. What we can say is that each one mattered. Each one had a life before encountering Popkov. Each one had people who loved them, memories that deserved to be made, futures that should have unfolded. Each one was a complete human being with thoughts and feelings and experiences and relationships. Each one deserved better than to die terrified and in pain, dumped in a forest like garbage, forgotten by everyone except the monster who killed them. And we can remember Svetlana and Evgenia, the survivors who carry Popkov's violence in their bodies and minds every day. They're part of this story too, testaments to human resilience, to the will to survive even when survival seems impossible. This is their story more than it's Popkov's. He's just the darkness that briefly touched their lives. They're the ones with names and faces and futures, even if those futures were cut short or forever altered by what he did. Remember them, not him, them. The taiga forest around Angarsk stretches for millions of square kilometers. Dense pine and birch trees, undergrowth thick enough to make walking difficult, terrain that's beautiful in summer and brutally cold in winter. It's largely uninhabited, save for occasional hunters and hikers and people who work in the forestry industry. Somewhere in those forests, there may still be remains. Victims of Mikhail Popkov who have never been found, whose disappearances were never officially connected to him, whose families might not even know they're among the dead. The forest keeps these secrets, slowly reclaiming bones and evidence, covering everything with layers of leaves and snow and time. Maybe one day someone will stumble across remains, a hunter tracking game, a hiker who wanders off trail, someone whose dog runs into the woods and won't come back, and there'll be another call to police, another investigation, another attempt to identify remains that are decades old. Maybe DNA will provide answers. Maybe there'll be nothing left to test. Maybe it'll just be another question mark, another unsolved mystery from those dark years. Or maybe the forest will keep its secrets forever. Maybe some of Popkov's victims will never be found, their final resting places known only to the man who put them there. He's in prison, and he'll die there eventually. When he dies, those secrets might die with him. The forest doesn't care. It just grows, season after season, year after year, slowly transforming death into new life, turning horror into soil from which new trees grow. It's beautiful and terrible at once, this process of reclamation and renewal. Angarsk sits at the edge of this forest, a city trying to move forward, trying to be known for something other than the horror that unfolded there. But the forest remembers, the earth remembers, and the people who lost loved ones to the werewolf, they remember too. They'll always remember. Winter comes every year to Siberia. The temperature drops. The darkness settles in for months. The cold becomes a physical presence, dangerous and unforgiving. But now when people wait at bus stops on frozen January nights, when they see a car slow down, when a driver offers them a ride, they hesitate. They remember. They know that the person behind the badge, the person offering help, might not be what they seem. Mikhail Popkov is in prison. The streets are safer. But the lesson remains. Evil can wear any face. Safety is never guaranteed. Trust must be earned, not automatically given. And somewhere in the forest the secrets remain, waiting, remembering, silent witnesses to horrors that must never be forgotten. This is the story of the werewolf of Angarsk. This is the story of Mikhail Popkov, Russia's deadliest serial killer. But more importantly, this is the story of 91 women who deserved better, 2 survivors who refused to be silenced, and a community that will carry these scars forever. May the dead be remembered. May the living find peace. And may we learn the lessons written in blood so that such horror is never allowed to happen again.